Okay, people starting to trickle in. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting in just a minute or two. I'm just gonna let everyone log in. I feel like I should be having some background music on for everyone. Good morning to everyone that's already waving good morning to us this morning on the raise hand feature. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Edwin Tan. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Community Relations here at San Jose State University. And I just want to welcome everyone to this morning's webinar training, Research-Informed Interventions and Leadership, COVID-19 and Anti-Asian Bias. This morning, this training will be recorded, and we will be distributing the recording after the webinar is completed, along with a post survey, if you would be so kind to complete that. This morning, before we get started, I just want to go over a couple ground rules. I suggest that you select the speaker views so that way you can just focus on the slides and the speaker. Let's see, what else do we have here? And if you do have any questions, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and questions can be posted there, but majority of times we will be addressing the questions on the last 30 minutes of the training, where we will have a dialogue session, a question and answer session that I will be moderating. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce Councilman Raul Perales. He is the councilman for San Jose District 3, which represents San Jose State University. And he, not only is he our council member, but he also is our fellow Spartan. And we're grateful to have him here this morning. And he has been championing issues in the community, including a resolution to condemn anti-Asian hostilities within the community and to look at future strategies to address xenophobia within our community. So without further ado, I welcome Councilman Perales.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tan, and good afternoon, or excuse me, good morning to everybody. And as Dr. Tan just shared, my name is Raul Perales, and I am the council representative for District 3, which encompasses all of downtown and the surrounding areas, including San Jose State University, my alma mater, very proud Spartan, including my wife as well. So we're a Spartan family, and we're already gearing up our son as well. This has indeed been a difficult time, and it is unfortunate that one of the sad side effects of this pandemic has been the blatant discrimination that our Asian American community across the country has faced. And you know, my office has been following, I know as many of us, the national, state, and regional reports on xenophobia actions against Asian Americans, and sadly, some that have turned violent. In San Jose, where over 35% of our population identifies as Asian Pacific Islander, residents here have reported being fearful to go out, as well as we have many Asian-owned businesses that reported sharp declines in their business in the weeks leading up to the shelter in place, and even more recently, bouts of vandalism. During this time, when our national leaders have chosen to be, unfortunately, divisive and xenophobic, our city, San Jose, has taken a more honorable stance. I stood personally in solidarity with our API community and collaborated with the API community organizations here to champion a resolution that was unanimously passed by our San Jose City Council denouncing xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiments. And furthermore, we directed our city staff to come back and present a strategy on how to combat such forms of xenophobia. And this is why I'm really glad that all of you have joined in this discussion today, led by Dr. Wong and Dr. Kwan and Dr. Tan, because it is important that we must continue to educate ourselves and to have a meaningful dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Councilman Peralez. We appreciate your leadership in the community and also for being our fellow Spartan, and we, as a Spartan community, stand beside you as we move forward in this. So without further ado, we'll go into the training, and to quickly introduce my fellow panelists. So you already know me. So we have Dr. Kathleen Wong Lau, who is our Chief Diversity Officer, and also Dr. Yvonne Kwan, who's an Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies here. And so I'll turn it over now to Dr. Wong.
Hello, good morning. And for those of you who are in another time zone, I think it's good afternoon. I want to thank Councilman Peralez for his wonderful introduction, but also for joining us today. And also I'm very excited to be here, excited in, in a sort of a difficult way. Important to be talking about this, but also very, very sensitive to all the things that all of us are facing in terms of COVID-19. So I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at San Jose State University. My areas of research have been on the emotional labor of women of color, doing work in diversity in higher education, and my areas are in intercultural communication. But I won't go too much into that. I used to run NCORE, for those of you who know about the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Ed. I'm in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is located in the President's Office. And so I'm really happy here to be here with my colleagues who are co-presenting. So I'll hand it over to Yvonne.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Also, thank you for joining us this morning or afternoon, whichever time zone you are in. And I am an assistant professor in Asian American Studies in the Department of Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences at San Jose State. I also direct the Ethnic Studies Collaborative, and I was a former co-chair of our Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, shortened as APIDA, task force. And so I want to kick off everyone, sorry, not kick off everyone, we kick off this webinar with a quick poll so that we can better understand the experiences our participants have had with anti-Asian racial incidents. So Edwin here has helped us queue up the poll. So please select examples of anti-Asian or anti-API xenophobic harassment you have experienced or witnessed after the onset of the COVID-19 global pandemic. So please take a few seconds to make your selection. All right, so we'll take another about 10 seconds. We have about 50% of folks who have completed.
All right, we'll just go ahead and cut off the poll, and now we'll share the results.
Great. All right, so if we can see the poll results here, the highest that we see, about the top two, are assumptions that Asians or Asian Americans have COVID-19 or have been exposed to it, and also the use of Kung Flu, Chinese virus, or Wuhan virus, right? So it seems like many of us have either experienced, witnessed, or read about the recent uptick in anti-Asian hate incidents. While there are many forms of violence and hostilities, I can cite, for example, the older Asian woman who was recently punched in the face at the bus stop, or another woman who had acid thrown on her while taking out the trash, and the father and son who were stabbed at the store. I want to briefly review 3 examples. Edwin. Okay, great, thank you so much. So this photo is of a protest against the shelter-in-place measures in Denver, Colorado. There seems to be a Caucasian woman hanging out of a Dodge Ram 1500 with a USA shirt on, carrying a sign that says "Land of the Free." There's also an Asian American nurse standing in front of that car. And if you were to watch the video of this incident, you would hear the woman shouting, "Go to China, you are a communist." So if we were to unpack this, what would the meta communication be? It would suggest that the Asian American man is a foreigner with questionable politics and does not belong here in the United States. And then our next example, this is one that could be couched as a joke, perhaps even a funny meme. There is a panda with a roll of toilet paper and small pieces of toilet paper kind of all around. And the words Kung Flu Pandemic are in large font with "chill your butts, there's plenty of toilet paper" in smaller font underneath. So what is the meta communication here? Though seeming like a harmless joke, the naming of the novel coronavirus as Kung Flu or the Chinese virus, as many of us have encountered, is not only inaccurate, but it also stokes further bias and hatred toward China, the Chinese, and API folks more broadly. And the next one we have here is beyond the two microaggressive examples I have shared. This one is very much a macroaggressive example of violence. This is from a recent article in the CBC News about a Vancouver man who attacked a 92-year-old man with dementia, Asian man with dementia, while the alleged perpetrator shouted racist remarks. And just within the last 48 hours, we have seen an exponential uptake of racialized violence against not only people of Asian descent, but also continued violence and justification of that violence against other people of color, especially Black folks in our nation. Take, for example, Ahmaud Arbery and Sean Reed. So this type of violence, however, is not new to many of us. It is very much grounded in the racial politics of the Western world. So next slide, please. I want to briefly give a historical context about how this anti-Asian and anti-Chinese in particular hostility is very much grounded in the legal, economic, and political history of the United States. Yesterday was the 138th year anniversary of the signing of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Though the people of Chinese descent were only 0.002% of the overall US population at the time, they were seen as a social menace and a peril, a yellow peril in particular, that would lead to the demise of the Anglo-American, including the Anglo-immigrant working class. So this law against Chinese laborers was the first immigration restriction passed to bar a particular national group from entry into the United States, though it would not be the last. Just very briefly, in 1907, an agreement was made between the United States government and the Japanese government to say that Japanese laborers would not be allowed to leave Japan for the United States. In 1917, the Asiatic Barred Zone was established to prevent immigration from all parts of Asia. And these laws were in place well until after World War II with the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952. These immigration restrictions parallel the anti-Asian sentiment that was felt among Asian immigrants and American-born people of Asian descent. From massacres against the Chinese in the late 1800s and the proliferation of violent movements against Filipinx and South Asian folks to the Executive Order of 9066 during World War II, in which all people of Japanese descent on the West Coast were labeled as the enemy race and forcibly placed into incarceration, macroaggressive hostilities were justified by law and practice.
So I want to bring up a couple of more contemporary issues. I think in addition to the ones that have occurred during COVID-19, I think historically, in more recent history for people of Asian descent in the United States, there are a couple of very lightning bolt moments, I think, for our community. Number one was the murder of Vincent Chin in the 1980s. For those of you who have taken Asian American Studies classes, or for those of you who are aware, if you're from the Detroit area of Michigan, you may be aware that there was a very blatant murder and attack of a young man named Vincent Chin on the eve of his marriage. impending marriage, in which he was mistaken as a person of Japanese descent, and the anti-Japanese sentiment was really coming from the demise of the American auto industry. And so what we see is the rise again of anti-Asian violence, but also xenophobia, the assumption that Vincent Chin was Japanese, the assumption that somehow if you're Asian, you're responsible for the demise of the American economy, and more importantly, the white American economy. And so I think that it's really important for us to understand that also in that case, the judicial system failed Vincent Chin in many ways similar to the things that we see going on today. The next one, a moment that we often refer to as being one that is about patriotism, and the moment that we find ourselves, is September 11th. And so many of you may know or have read about or yourselves experienced the discrimination and violence against Muslim Americans and Sikh Americans who were sometimes mistaken as Muslims because of their traditional religious dress in many ways. And so what we saw was an instantaneous rise of violence, micro and macroaggressions all across the United States. So I want to talk about macroaggressions for a little bit. A lot of this workshop is really about addressing microaggressions in the workplace, but it's really important to also talk about macroaggressions and the differences. So when we talk about macroaggressions, perpetrators of anti-Asian hate incidents, they range from various ethnic and racial identities. So even in a place like the Bay Area that is very multiracial, where we have a very, very diverse community, what we find is that we sometimes have horizontal macroaggressions from other groups of color, as well as from people who are in the majority. And a lot of times people are in many ways not interrogating and thinking about the historical relations of all of our groups and the historical inequities faced by many of our groups. What I need to say and what we want you to know is that macroaggressions, of course, need to be directly and publicly condemned within an organization, and particularly by those who are in authority and leadership. And so, like the directives and the edicts that are coming out from different city councils, as well as we may have seen from some private companies regarding incidents that have been committed by their employees, it is incredibly important for some way for leadership to message that this is wrong and be very specific about how it's wrong. Discipline needs to be handed out accordingly, and it needs to be done, of course, fairly within employment policies and practices. And sometimes they may need to be elevated to a criminal or civil process. What's important for people to understand is that, you know, we need to sort of make some assessments immediately to see whether there's a direct threat in that situation versus something that's a microaggression. So sometimes when we're trying to address microaggressions, there are constraints of privacy, employment law, and confidentiality, of course, of disciplinary actions. But again, what we need to do is to have leadership address it and be aware that we are addressing this and that this has been taken care of, right? So we want to let our employees know that an incident has occurred because of privacy and confidentiality. We may not be able to tell you the details. However, we will use all the resources and tools available to us to deal with this. And what happens is if you don't do that is that rumors about what was or what not done or what did or didn't happen will permeate through the organization. So what do you do? The first thing you need to do is in a situation, let's say someone says something, uses a racial slur, okay? The first thing you need to do, and this is again a macroaggression, you need to ask, is everyone safe, right? Is the macroaggression a direct threat? That's number two. So am I saying I'm calling someone a name and I'm going to, and you're threatening them with something, right? Either loss of a job or physical threat, that sort of thing. And then number three, you need to elevate to the proper authorities or company leaders in real time. So timeliness is incredibly important in terms of macroaggression. So you need to assess that situation.
Now that Kathy has reviewed the macroaggressions, I want to go over a little bit of the racial microaggressions that are more insidious but can add up and are quite disconcerting. So we have a definition on this next slide from Daryl Wing-Sue and his team, and they have defined racial microaggressions as commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults. So in this next slide, I know there's a lot going on there, but I'm going to just break this down just a little bit. So there are three types of racial microaggressions: the micro insult, micro assault, and micro invalidation. These include distancing oneself or tightening one's mask, face mask, when near Asian or API folks, not patronizing API-owned businesses, joking about how Asians eat bats, assuming Asian Americans or API folks are not from here, and defending the use of the Chinese virus or Kung flu. So while these may seem not such a big deal, right? Like, oh, just, you know, you're being too serious or whatnot, is a lot of times how people, the reactions people get when we raise these things. Daryl Sue and his team has found that these microaggressions definitely add up and pose highly negative effects on people of color.
Yeah, so I do want to, I want to just briefly sort of explain why microaggressions have the power to disable us in terms of our cognitive functioning and the ways in which we feel a sense of belonging. So this comes from research on, you know, how do people feel, so I'm going a little bit off script here before I go into the Maslow's hierarchy, but how do people feel included and able to contribute to their work teams, for example, right? So what we know is when a microaggression is committed, for the person that's targeted, when it's a macroaggression, it's very clear. Your mind says, oh yeah, that is wrong. You're waiting for someone to say something. Hopefully someone will, but even if someone doesn't say something, you know, and you know that people in the room know there is something wrong. The problem with microaggressions is that it's right there, it's skirting on that, you know, should I bother to, you know, disturb the work that's going on? Should I bother to disturb the discussion, because it seems kind of minor, right? It's not posing a direct threat. It's all these sort of things. And because of that perception of what is going on in the dynamics and that analysis that's going on actually takes up, it spins in the back of your head and your working memory and takes up some of your cognitive complexity and your cognitive capacity, right? When we look at things like stereotype threat or other types of ways in which people are impacted in terms of their cognitive load, this directly affects organizations in terms of looking at innovative thinking. When we talk about diversity through innovation, that actually upends all of that ability to do that. Because in the back of my mind, I'm wondering if the next thing I say is going to be evaluated for my pure ideas, or whether it's being evaluated because of the source and stereotypes about who I am. And so these microaggressions tap into what we know exists in terms of macroaggressions as well. Right? So they're all connected. So it's not just the straw that broke the camel's back, or it's this tiny little thing that's happening that's unrelated. Microaggressions have an incredibly important, it's important to know, it has an incredible cognitive load on individuals. And it also transfers to other people who may be also from marginalized groups, who then wonder, if this person isn't safe, next year it could be me, right? Or next week it could be me, or next crisis it could be me. So talking about when these microaggressions seem to uptick during times of crisis. Maslow's hierarchy, as you know, talks about the ways in which people are able to attend to all the things that they need to do at their conscious and unconscious level. And with the highest, of course, being self-actualization. And so right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're in a crisis situation where we're really operating, trying to find, masks, trying to find a way to get in and out of our house. All those sorts of things are happening at the lower level. What we know is when we are in a crisis situation, we are less able to consciously override some of the base assumptions that we had when we were socialized growing up. Now that's kind of, in some ways, it's not an excuse. So I'm not trying to say that there's a reason, there's an excuse for people to commit microaggressions. But what I'm saying is that all of us grow up with a lot of bias because of the ways in which we consume media, from the cartoons that we watch to the products that are available to all the social media. So we know from the previous slides that there's a lot going on in the culture, right, that shapes our beliefs. What we do through education and epiphanous moments and really hard learning is that we override them, but many of them are still there. And so in times of crisis, we are less able to override some of those base feelings. Now, you might sort of think that's really depressing. I want to share briefly that in gerontology studies, what we'll see is that often with people who are experiencing some sort of cognitive dysfunction or loss, what happens is you will find people who have been champions all of their lives in terms of equity and social justice will start using language that is racist or sexist or homophobic, expressing ideas that you would not ever associate with this person because they've spent their entire lives overriding this. So although that's depressing, the good news is it shows that we can override it, right? But during times of crisis in particular is when these things leak out. And that's the opportunity to provide a learning, teaching experience, teachable moment, and a way to help people see what's going on in themselves. So, well, why should we care, right? So what happens is when you receive microaggressions, it produces a hostile and invalidating social climate for all the reasons that I just talked about. You have a loss of institutional respect and cohesion among the team. People may feel like, gosh, I'm not going to give 100%. They may not even making that conscious decision. They just don't feel safe to do so. And then there's psychological distress, anxiety, trauma, and of course, depression. There is on the side of productivity, there's a loss of employment productivity. And then there's, of course, a loss of institutional reputation. And we all work at places probably that have this loss of institutional reputation when we fail to address the issues that we should be addressing, right? COVID-19 anti-Asian bias. Oh, is this your slide, Yvonne? Go ahead.
I can take this. Here, so recent studies, especially from San Francisco State and Intertrend Communications, have found that there's been an increase among Asian API folks about the worry about racial bias, right? So if you can see in this graph with the box around it, is that across the board, whether you are an immigrant or whichever racial group you're from, ethnic group you're from, or if you're American born, there's close to almost 80%, definitely above 70% of folks are worried about racial bias. And Councilman Perales also raised this too, right? In San Jose, even such a diverse and 35% API population in San Jose, there are a lot of people also worried about racial bias. And where is that coming from? So we see types of discrimination that include verbal harassment, right? That seems to be the greatest one, but also there are more kind of macro level things too. Like I've seen videos of people getting spat on, the punching, the stabbing, all of that kind of stuff too. And then a lot of this happens within the business. So this is why it's relevant to our community members joining us today, because a lot of this is based on workplace discrimination. So I think it's really important to talk about the impacts of course, macroaggressions, but especially as Kathy mentioned earlier about microaggressions, the ways in which microaggressions add up and kind of take that cognitive load of people, especially in this situation of unprecedented situation of the pandemic.
Let's talk about the impacts of being in an organization and trying to deal with these issues, right? So as we know, some of the challenges are that there's a fear of possible retaliation, right? So if I'm the target and let's say someone makes a joke about, Kung Fu flu, and I say something and I say, hey, that's not cool. In the back of my mind, particularly if I'm a low-ranking person, or if I'm someone who's new to the organization or new to the team, I might fear possible retaliation, either because I don't feel like my status is secure because I have not received those messages or coaching that lets me know that I am. It can create a fear of saying the wrong thing and being stigmatized as being racist forever. So sometimes somebody, says, and this may have happened to you, that wasn't really cool. And then after the meeting with the person is like, I'm not racist. I swear to God, I'm not racist. And I really like Asian people, or, whatever it is that people say, right? And I'm sorry I'm using those examples. Those have happened to me. I'm sure that some of them have happened to you. And even with good intention, there is a fear of talking about this hot topic, right, of racism in the workplace. It can create a fear on the part of targets of being seen as a victim, weak and overly sensitive. So, oh, there she goes again. Why is she always so sensitive? Do we have to go through this again? And then it can create horizontal issues among marginalized groups, particularly if the group being targeted has relative privilege, right? So when we talk about Silicon Valley and we talk about many of our institutions, there are a significant number of Asian Americans who are in management and who've been able to move up through the ranks. Sure, there is the bamboo ceiling and there's a lot of things going on there in terms of relative success, but in many ways, what can happen is for many Asian Americans, this may be the first time where they're actually quite concerned from the moment they leave their door when they go out to go shopping, or if they're essential employees, worried about their safety because of this particular COVID-19 anti-Asian bias. At the same time, other groups have been experiencing this forever, for a long time, and in terms of the history of the United States. And so those relationships can be made a lot more complicated, right? And a challenge if people aren't equipped to talk about them. The benefits, of course, is that you can change the behavior of the entire group or team or organization moving forward in terms of expectations of professional behavior and conduct, right? So this is something that is not going to get by. People will say something, and so people have an expectation that they need to think before they talk. It can set the tone for meta communication to happen in the future should these issues arise again. And this is really important. Being able to talk about the talk, right? So I'm a communication studies person, but being able to talk about the talk raises the level of analysis a little bit higher so that you can transfer that learning into other situations. If you only limit it to that one incident and you don't really talk about how do we relate to each other in general, how do we talk about climate? If you don't raise it up to that level, then a lot of those, you lose that opportunity for benefit. Developing a sense of relative support for other marginalized communities. So what we know is from research that if we let things slide for one group in terms of marginalization, every single person that's in that, within proximity of that interaction themselves subconsciously wonders if it could be me next, or it was me last week and my group. And so this is going to be the culture of the work team or the culture of the organization. And again, much of this is experienced at the subconscious level, right? You can create a culture of learning and processing to reduce stigmatization for both agent and target. So being able to talk about it, right, is again really important to create that culture. Okay, so unfortunately, when microaggressions occur, what research shows is the biggest thing that people do is do nothing. So people just kind of, or they kind of just pretend it didn't happen, or there's uncomfortable laughing, and then everyone just kind of pushes on, right? And so even that feels like the safest thing to do because it feels indirect, or, you're trying to sort of keep the team going. We want to, not bring up these bad issues. Maybe it wasn't intentional. You have all of these ideas spinning in your head. The risks are you have a wholesale loss of trust and leadership in the sense of the team, right? Number two, there's harms to the target. It bleeds out not only to that person, but as I've spoken, it bleeds out to everyone who identifies in that group. And then number three, the harm spreads out to other marginalized identities at the unconscious level. It could be me and my people next week, next meeting, next year.
All right, so now I want to pivot to what we can do about all of this, right? So with microaggressions, there are also micro-interventions. From a social psychological perspective on organizations, leaders need to focus on two levels. Effective intervention for the microaggressor and for everyone else, including the targets of the microaggression, allies, and bystanders. So these interventions can be separated into 4 different pillars. So you can see here on our graphic, making the invisible visible is the first. The second is disarming the micro or macroaggression. The third, seeking external intervention. And the fourth, educating the offender. So just let's quickly use an example of you overhear someone not wanting to go to Asian businesses because they fear that all Asians have COVID-19. So the first intervention could be that you directly tell someone the facts about how anyone can get COVID, right? The second intervention could be that you disagree with the person. So you speak up, you disagree with the person and highlight how their assumptions are problematic because they are assuming that API folks are perpetual foreigners, right? That they're not from here and that's why they must have the virus. The third intervention could be that you reach out to others amongst your kind of ethnic group or your allies to workshop through this microaggression. And lastly, you can appeal to the person's values and principles. Hopefully they have some values and principles around equity and just empathy for other people. And so that's more on the kind of individual microaggressor intervention. But if we elevate that a little bit to the institutional or organizational levels, we can still see how these 4 pillars still ring true. So you can see here, though, across these 4 pillars, there is much more of this organizational institutional intervention. So 1 is logging the inequitable practices, 2, speaking to management and checking, 3, checking with others in your team who may have been affected, and 4, instituting long-term mandated trainings to show the people in your team that your organization or your institution cares about these microaggressions and how they are affecting your team's morale, but also well-being, and of course, you know, if we think about on an organizational level, their productivity as well. And so now we pivot more to an audience participation part of this. So I'm gonna give you this one scenario and we're gonna talk through it, okay? So while on a Zoom call, you hear someone say, wow, there are so many Asians on this call. I'm so glad that we're on Zoom instead of meeting in person. So Edwin, if you can cue our poll there, what would you do in this scenario? All right, great. We have about 50% of folks who have responded. We'll take a few more seconds. All right, I think we'll end the poll here. Okay, so we can see from the results that we definitely have some social justice warriors out there who are very eager to speak out about this, right? Because our most popular response is express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic because it was anti-Asian. And then also just below that is express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic. And it's really nice to see that no one responded to not a big deal, right? But there are some folks who are afraid to speak up. And actually, if you've done any kind of bystander training, you'll see that the most common response of what people do when they hear something that is problematic, either sexist, racist, homophobic, etc., is that they are afraid to speak up and do something. So maybe, Kathy, you and I can kind of just jump in and workshop through these responses a little bit here.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take the first 2, with the highest response, the first 2 responses. So express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic, and then express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic because it was anti-Asian. So both of those are seemingly direct responses, but I want to tell you what the research says in terms of the impact, the differential impact or the extra impact of the second response. So when we express that, hey, that was really uncomfortable, that was problematic, right? So that puts that person on notice. So that's on that 4 quadrant, direction of what you're doing. That puts that person on notice. But what it doesn't do is that it doesn't really give the specificity that's going to take care of some of that cognitive thing that's spinning around in your head. Is that, does this person actually understand that this is anti-Asian, or that this is problematic and it could hit other Asian Americans, right? The same way in which someone might use a racial slur against any group, and then someone says, we just don't do slurs here, right? When you say we just don't do slurs here, that is good. I'm not saying that's bad, but more effective is we don't use racial slurs against African Americans, or you actually specifically name. And what that does is it creates a level of projection of your empathy and understanding, not the squishy, affective empathy, but the cognitive empathy, that you deeply understand that the moment that we're in, this actually has more power than what's happening here in the moment. And that's what we need. So we don't just say, yeah, that was bad when it's sexism. We say that was misogynistic. These are the reasons why. You can keep your voice calm and do it. You don't have to scream at people and try to get people, you know, fearful. But you do need to, the best practice is really to say specifically what it was. And that way you are not just taking care of in the moment that behavior, but you're also taking care of the possibility of that person taking in information on these similar issues in the future, right? So that's what the research shows. I'll talk about those first two. And then maybe you can jump in, Yvonne.
For sure, yeah. So if we see that last response here, we have 15% of people who have decided that they will reach out to the team later to address the xenophobic microaggressions. What the research has also shown is that even if you don't act in the immediate, if you are able to reach out to your team afterwards, it does have substantial impact, right? If you know, maybe you're the team leader and you're just like, wow, maybe you're the first response, expressed discomfort in general, but you didn't know exactly what to say in that moment. You know, it's okay. Come back to it though. Don't just avoid it and hope that it goes away, because it will not just go away. And related to what Kathy said about the first point about the expressing discomfort and say that, oh, that was wrong, that was not okay, we don't do that kind of stuff. Same thing about the interrupt and redirect to something else. If you just kind of pivot to like, oh, well, what are you all doing now that we're all sheltering in place? What are you watching on TV, right? Because you feel the discomfort, but then you don't want to unpack that and you pivot to something else. That is also kind of just sweeping it under the rug and not a very good practice in terms of the management or leadership level.
Yeah, and what I do want to emphasize is what we're not asking for you is to give a dissertation on why that was wrong, right? What you need to do is to be direct, be specific, and then move on so that, and then you may have more meaningful follow-up conversations. You know, you could plan a meeting, you could give readings, you could do something, right? A workshop or something like that. So we're not saying that you break all of the meeting and say, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about that. Because actually that actually doesn't work. In the ways that you might think in terms of social psychology. So,
for sure. And then if you also want to elevate to the level of the institutional intervention, that's something that you can pick up on later, right? And instituting those long-term mandated trainings and the such. Right. All right. I think we'll move on to the next example that we have. So in this next example, while speaking with a friend, you hear, I don't know why the Asians are now complaining. Black and Latinx folks have been dealing with this type of racism forever. We didn't see the Asians speak up or advocate for us. So what would you do in this scenario? Great, we have about 50% of respondents who have finished this poll. Great, we'll wait about 5 more seconds. Awesome, all right, I think we'll end the poll there. Thank you so much, Edwin. So we see here that the most popular response is the express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic because our historical relations from the groups we are from are more complicated, right? And then following that, the next one is express discomfort and say that the statement was problematic. So we have the more directed statement and then the broader statement as well. Kathy, you want to jump in here and help us talk through this?
Yeah, so this is, you know, so I do want to share that both of these cases actually came from situations that we have been involved in very recently. So I think it's very heartening that people chose. I think express discomfort with reference to the historical complicated relationships that we have. What we I think, and I kind of speak, and I don't assume I know what the backgrounds are or the racial ethnic backgrounds of people who are on this webinar, but I know in our discussions amongst the three of us, and certainly with many other API leaders, that we are in a moment in time, I think, for transformative learning even within our own community about issues of injustice. We only have to sort of see this constellation and now this nexus of what has been happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, and especially, I'm sorry, I just had an animal come up behind me, so sorry. But also in terms of Ahmaud Arbery and what happened in Indianapolis just yesterday in terms of attacks, wholesale attacks, violent attacks on African Americans in our country. I think that for many Asian Americans, it's a time of reckoning to understand that we also are not exempt from the historical oppression that many groups face in the United States. We also have the invisibility of Native Americans, in terms of their high death rates from COVID-19, as well as for African Americans. Here in Santa Clara County, the highest death rate disproportionate to the population is among Latinx folks in our area. And so it's important, I think, for us to educate our own people in terms of being API ourselves, but also to reach out in solidarity and to help understand that all of this we're not equally impacted. In fact, learning how we are specifically differently impacted actually will help us in terms of our literacy and how we strategize in working together in coalition. So.
For sure. And I think this has been a quite teachable moment for me when I am working with my students. So I teach general education classes in Asian American studies. And in the past, when I would teach on Asian American history, violence, and anti-immigrant sentiment and the such, when we get to the contemporary context, a lot of my students would say, yeah, it was so terrible in the past, but we're doing good now. Like we're, you can see the median income for API for Asian American folks, right? And also educational attainment rates and all of that. We're doing good. So folks kind of like buy into that idea of the model minority myth, right? But what that does, as many of you probably know already, is that when we don't disaggregate the data, we can't see the particular historical context and the continued contemporary needs of our communities, right? So for example, we can see that oftentimes with Southeast Asian refugees, also Native Pacific Islander folks, their rates of educational attainment and also their median income are not on par with the rest of the Asian American groups, right? And so that's problematic to just lump everyone together and say that we're all doing fine. And also, I want to definitely acknowledge that, with social movements and the such, we often don't see as many API folks out, protesting or recognizing the violence against Black and Brown and Native folks. But that isn't to say that there aren't API folks doing this kind of work, right? But I think really it is a pivotal moment right now, instead of trying to divide and say that, look, we're not, the API folks haven't stepped up, so we don't want to recognize their incidents of racial bias. It's just like, well, now welcome to the club, right? Because that's dismissive, right? And what that functions to do is to further divide us instead of talking about those coalitional politics that can be tricky, but finding solidarities despite our difference. And it's not about oppression Olympics, but trying to see how these larger structures really come together to create the proliferations of xenophobic incidents.
Mm-hmm. So what that means, and really appreciate what you've shared, Yvonne. I think what it means though is, I think if you're a manager on a team, right? You're a supervisor, and something occurs. If you haven't been doing your homework, if you have let other slurs slide by, you've let other microaggressions slide by, then you need a lot of repair work to do, right? So let's say you are, you know, and I'll say this because we did do some reach out to the tech sector, and much of the tech sector has a significant number of Asian Americans as employees. So if you are now talking about anti-Asian bias, but you have not previously talked about other types of bias in the same way, with the same level of meaning and passion, then that really shows the entire organization that you have a lot of homework to do, right? And so again, it's really important to have specific literacy in the different ways in which people are positioned and the different ways in which people are experiencing the current context. Something that I say to people all the time is, if you are in a position of privilege where you're not impacted by, you know, for example, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in the same way as your African-American and Black and Brown employees, you need to understand that when people are coming to work, that they have been impacted. And so anything that you are saying or doing is telling people you either understand their context or you don't. And I think that we're in this time in our culture in the United States, but certainly around the world, where leaders have to be more responsible to understand and have what we call cognitive empathy. It's not necessarily feeling empathy, but it's really a literacy and deep understanding of the lives that other people lead, right? So for example, among Asian Americans, I know many people that are worried sick about their elderly Asian parents going out to the grocery store. Because they're elderly, someone might push them down, as what happened in Vancouver. You know, someone could spit on them, they could be hurt, all those things. That has been experienced by other groups as well, right? While they're jogging, while they're running, you know, doing anything that everyone assumes should be safe. And so when you are a manager, you need to understand you have no idea what happened to that person or what's happening in that person's family right before they came into work or they came in on Zoom. And so it's really important. Context really matters. Interconnectedness really matters. And understanding that these issues are systemic. They are not individual. Some microaggressions will come from the nicest people you know, the people that you love having coffee with, the people that you hope after, you know, lockdown or shelter in place is over, you can go out and have a drink with. They can come from the nicest people. So it's because these issues are systemic. They really come, we draw from how we've been socialized and the things that we've been led to believe are the ways that the society should be organized, and that many of them occur subconsciously. And so it's really important, I think, to know that when we express specificity and understanding, that eliminates a lot of our bias pathways within ourselves for the next encounter, right? So we're trying to give you some advice on some of the specificity for Asian Americans or APIs, but there's also specificity for other groups as well. Although the practices might be similar, what comes out in terms of what you're saying might be very different because of that.
Yeah, and I think this is a pivotal moment for us to see how across groups we can create these alliances and coalitions that are really based upon understanding each other's context, right? And not just going like, ooh, that sucks, right? On the individual level, but as Kathy said, the more systemic level of that. And through various conversations we've had, we've also talked about, as Kathy raised, that friendliness metric, right? Or that, oh, this person is so nice, but then perhaps because they're so nice, it's very difficult for you to then speak up and say, you know, hey, that thing that you said was inappropriate for these XYZ reasons. Because maybe otherwise, like Kathy said, that you like to go out for drinks and whatnot. And this research has been shown also through sexual misconduct trainings too, right? Someone would say something that is very inappropriate while they're out on drinks and whatnot. And it creates this kind of on guard feeling, that microaggression within you that kind of builds up and that creates that cognitive capacity load. So yeah.
Great.
All right, and now I think we can segue over to our moderated Q&A.
Yeah, so we've definitely covered a lot of information in a short amount of time, and we know that this could be a multi-day type of seminar setting, but if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions within the Q&A portion, and I'll be happy to relay them out to our two expert panelists. I know I've received several questions about slides and recordings, and the recording will be shared as well as the slides after this event is over, and they will be accompanied by a short survey that you can share any additional questions as well as your feedback on today's event. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to click on the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen, and we can relay some of your questions. So Tom Mizu asked the questions, can we talk a little bit more the resentment of Asian Americans by other people of color, more detail about how to work with these other groups and to create maybe along those lines some of the allyships that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I'll jump into that. I think in my experience of working with different types of organizations, I really I feel like there needs to be more structured, I think, approaches and work and homework, I think, for different groups to be done. These can be done through ERG sometimes, right? Employee resource groups. It can be done through multicultural centers. It certainly can be done through, I know that there's many .edu folks on this call. It can be done through your student cultural centers as well. And I think that, you know, and I don't know how Dr. Kwan and Dr. Tan feel about this, but I really think that we have a moment where we can educate our own API communities about systemic issues. I think the systemic part is the hardest part for people to get. And I think if you don't understand the systemic nature and historical nature of what's going on, it becomes very difficult to then understand what is happening for other people. It's a teachable moment that needs to be driven home and not assumed, right? That you're going to transfer that understanding to other groups. It actually has to be scaffolded and talked about. We also have a situation where we have a community where people are coming in from other countries, right? In terms of generationally. And so what we have is we have the export of our colonial racist media and materials into other countries, then it's brought back home to roost into our communities as well. And so I think talking about all those openly, while also having that specificity again and literacy about other groups and studying other groups, taking ethnic studies classes about other groups other than your own. You know, I think all of those things are really important, but again, to structure it and plan it and not let it just sort of say, if we expose people to materials, that cross-pollination is going to happen. Because of all the things that we experience in society, it's not going to automatically happen, right? We also are living in a time where Americans, including in California, are more racially and ethnically segregated than they were even like 15, 20 years ago, residentially, as well as everyday interactions in the workplace, or like who gets invited to people's homes. Of course, right now we're not doing that, you know, for barbecues and for dinner and stuff. And so there's been a resegregation in the United States in ways that can decrease the perspectives and understanding of other people. So.
Thank you, Kathy. So we have a couple of parents on here asking, how do you address microaggressions to a child, to their children?
Well, I guess
and we have a child on our screen now.
We have a child on our screen now. So, yeah, so I'm assuming that this, okay, so there's two things, right? So if your child receives a microaggression, or if your child is perpetrating one, I suppose, right? So this is actually something that's really has been happening a lot on Zoom calls for K through 12, apparently. So there are parents who are sitting there with their children, and then in the Zoom call, a child says something about the Chinese virus, or they say something about, you know, whatever group, right? And then the parent is there waiting for the teacher to say something, and the teacher doesn't say anything, and other kids don't say anything, and there's a lot of silence. So I think it's important to you know, to directly process with your children, but to make sure that you aren't creating binaries of us versus them at that young age. So I would say that's really important. It's explaining, right, what's happening, but not excusing what's happening. And what research shows is that children are actually more cognitively complex than we give them credit for. We actually socialize them to become less cognitively complex, starting at the age of like 3 or 4, all the way up through high school. So that's the bad news. The good news is they're capable of understanding sort of both and, or complexity also with a sameness, right? So they can understand that people are similar, they have humanity, but they also are very, very different, and they experience the world very differently. And then you talk about how unjust it is. It's hard. I mean, it's hard. I've done that with my own children. I know many people have done it with their children. But in the end, you give them a lot of support, and also support the fact that they feel uncomfortable, that's valid, right? To trust their own sense of what's going on. It's really important for a parent not to be dismissive. That's probably the biggest advice. Do not be dismissive of what's going on.
Yeah, and I've also heard a lot of children being the targets of that microaggression, or, microaggression as well. And so instead of just kind of like that pivot and redirect, right, is really to, I think, speak to children in a way that, you don't have to use all this kind of research ease or anything like that, but just talk to them in terms of like what Dr. Wong was saying about the humanity, the base humanity of people, and to really try to unpack that discomfort. So I again, you don't have to tell the kids about this, but I really like using the work of Megan Bowler, who has a book called The Pedagogy of Discomfort, right? So to use that as a teaching moment with children, because they see a lot of this, in either in their classrooms and on Zoom, or even through YouTube videos that they watch and the such, because so much of the passing comments about microaggressions get swept under the rug because they're so quick, right? But what I've seen is that with parents who are really able to explain to their children, not just about racial microaggressions, but perhaps even like sexual misconduct and that kind of stuff too. So really giving the child the agency and teaching them that they have agency and have the capacity to work through these complexities.
Then we have Crystal asking, what would you suggest for individuals who are part of other marginalized groups and might not feel safe intervening in more public and emotionally charged situations, but still want to assist?
I think there's been a great training by Hollaback on this, on the bystander training, is that for sure one of the things that you can do is, if you don't feel comfortable, calling the person out and saying that was racist. There are other things that you can do. For example, you can distract. Maybe, there is an incident happening and you can just go, hey, guys, hey, y'all, what time is it? What time is it? I think like we should, just kind of doing that pivot, right? If that's probably not the best thing to do as a leader of an organization, but as kind of a bystander, right? You can do that. Or even later on, approach the person who was affected by the microaggression or the macroaggression to tell them, I see you, I hear you, I feel you, right? And what are ways in which we can kind of come together to address this with our management, our leadership, or, I think people feeling heard and seen and felt is very important as well, is very important.
Yeah, and I also think being transparent about how you struggled with saying something in the moment, because I'm sure all of us I've been in that situation, right? So that, and it's not an excuse, but it's really to be human and to say, I struggled, I wish I had said something, but these are the reasons why I felt I couldn't, and I need to work harder. I'm not going to put it on you to educate me, but I need to learn how to step up to the plate, or this is the only way that I can, right? The other thing I want to mention is that often in our intact work teams, the ones that we are familiar with and that we work in, there sometimes can be lines of historical bullying, power plays, and all that stuff. And so none of this is happening in a vacuum with equal players with equal power. Sometimes even someone who is a chair or a supervisor or a manager might be, because of their identity, being a woman, being LGBTQ, being someone who is, who has an accent, whatever, for whatever reason, is in a position where they are normally in most situations disempowered. And so for that person, it's a lot harder to do the things that we're recommending. And so it's really important, you know, to also, one of the reasons why it's, you know, if you have an organization that understands these issues and is trying to address these issues, is to elevate it, because sometimes you don't know there's already an existing investigation going on. There might already be some sort of resolutions going on between people. So if you've ever been in an organization or a unit where you feel like you're in a tennis match watching two people go at each other every time you have a meeting, in those situations, when microaggressions happen, the response has to be a lot more well thought out in terms of, you know, understanding what's going on and what's the best way to intervene. So we're never advocating that you put yourself in an unsafe position, right? Whether it's for your position, your job, or whether it is for, you know, your own personal safety.
And then we have a couple questions in a similar vein, but I'll share one particularly. When confronting someone that has used a microaggression, is there a language that you recommend to assure the conversation is productive so that the person engages with you rather than becomes defensive? And what if they continue to insist that what they said was harmless or what they did was harmless?
So I would say first, if you use perspective language. I understand your perspective. Here are some other perspectives. We know that there are other perspectives out there similar to yours. This is not unheard of. There was something in the news that happened last week. You can even probably pull something up online and that duplicates what that person says. So you're normalizing it in a way that doesn't say it's acceptable, but yeah, so yes, this is, you know, so what we know is that there are also other perspectives, and here are some perspectives I'm going to share with you on how people might take it. With the warning that about retaliation, warning about not going and interviewing people to member check to see whether, Kathy Wong told me you experienced this is how you experienced it, right? So, but to educate them about, you know, your responsibility is to provide a good working climate as a manager. That's your job, or as a team member. And so you're taking responsibility by also making sure that those voices and those experiences that you may not have access to because you either can't hear them or see them, this is what is the impact on the organization. And so I'm taking responsibility. I think that it's also important to try to help that person understand this is a managerial issue. This is not personal, right? I know it's hard because sometimes it feels very personal, but I think that doing that is really important. If that person resists and keeps saying that, you know, I feel like I was entitled to do this, you just need to say, I understand. Thank you for letting me know that that's how you feel about it, but I'm letting you know how I feel about it as your manager, right? And so this is not to stigmatize you. It doesn't mean that we can't talk together anymore. It doesn't mean, but I do need you to understand that this is not acceptable, right? And to say it very calmly and very matter-of-factly. It's very, very hard when we in situations where people are denying it, right?
Yeah, I think that comes back to, I saw a question on there, like, how do you respond to people who say that I'm not racist? Right. So I think many of us have encountered that before. Or I've encountered even with some of my colleagues as well, who would say, I'm really woke. I promise I'm really woke. Right. And that in itself needs a lot of unpacking too. Right. And sometimes I feel like, especially for folks who are from more marginalized communities or backgrounds, it's also not always our responsibility to educate that person, right? And that's why I think in terms of reaching out to resources, especially groups that are part of that, maybe that person's identity, background, or whatnot, can be very helpful as well to make that connection. Because I think a lot of times people of color, marginalized people feel like that extra tax on them to always have to educate people about this, right? And sometimes the most difficult to reach are folks who don't acknowledge that they might in their core have some of that racial bias. But just as you know, Dr. Wang Lao said earlier about, you know, with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sometimes it's so deeply embedded within us, it's very difficult to identify, right? And while we may try to do that, also, again, marginalized folks can find other resources. And that's why I think on the institutional level, there needs to be institutional support of this as well.
And then going along with the team dynamics, how can teams better approach the model, quote, assume best intent, end quote, and determine better ways to quantify agreeableness collaboration? I feel the phrase only benefits the transgressor.
Yeah, I would say I agree with, I feel a lot of agreement with that question, right? So I often say, instead of assuming best intent, I assume that everyone can learn, right? So I always say, I come to this assuming everyone can learn. I've had to learn over my lifetime about issues that are not part of my identity and my, my social circle. And I can think of decades where I had to work very hard, for example, to learn about Native American issues in particular in the United States and in the Americas. And so it's everybody has the potential to learn. And your intent is, of course, I assume everyone's intent is good, but that analysis does not get us towards learning, right? And so I always start with, that's true. However, I assume everyone has the ability to learn. It's not, it's not a very sophisticated move. I mean, in some ways it's kind of a redirect, but I think what happens is when we're talking about intent, we start tapping into the historical, I would say, colonial belief about goodness and religion and, ethics and all those things. And most of the things that we do are not ones that are intentionally evil most of the time. We certainly have people that are doing that. There's a law to take care of a lot of that, right? In terms of criminal law and all those sort of things on hate incidents and stuff. But in most organizations, of course, people are well-intended, but, I think that for some reason, when we transpose that onto sexual assault, we instantly say, oh yeah, we take that intent equation out more easily psychologically, right? But for some reason on race, we tend to want to focus on intent. And I think it's that recapture. There's a concept from social psychology called aversive racism. So being aversive to something, aversive racism. And what that is there are people, and people's social psychology is wanting to be perceived as non-racist becomes the driving primary mechanism of sort of the template for all arguments in that person's head. Not all, but many, right? And so what happens is, for someone who is talking to that person, you don't realize that that's what they're trying to do. They may not even realize that's what they're trying to do. But what happens is then you can't have a really direct discussion about behavior, about what actually happened in this interaction, because they're trying to recover their own sense of who they are, right? And so if you really believe and you've done these unconscious bias tests, right? And you know that all of us have certain biases that we have inherited through our own socialization, right? And lack of exposure to other groups. Then you know that it's there. And so this recovery project is not useful. The only way you're going to get to that mostly not racist is really by directly addressing the biases that you have in a direct way, instead of in a kumbaya, I'm going to be a good person way, right? So long answer, sorry, but yeah.
So from an educator's perspective, we are often taught to interrupt. How do you feel about interrupting and asking exploratory questions like, why do you say that? What do you mean? Tell me more, as a strategy for avoiding putting someone on the defense with someone more direct in the scenarios you're provided?
Yeah, I think for sure that allows us to kind of slow down a little bit and to reveal what are the kind of underlying assumptions that a person is basing this on. And sometimes those questions can kind of jolt a person out of that, like, I didn't mean anything by it. But if we kind of drill down to it, it's also kind of that teaching moment, right? Instead of just redirecting and speaking and just kind of giving all the knowledge and all that stuff, because people can turn off, right? Because as Dr. Wong was saying that, there's kind of that self-preservation. But when we kind of open up the dialogue, let's talk, it's not to say let's make the aggressor, the microaggressor, the perpetrator feel better about themselves, but to understand where are those sentiments coming from? Because, a lot of this, as we said, is from the socialization of the biases that we have, but sometimes it's not in the cognitive, right? It's that kind of an implicit and consciousness, but making that explicit allows us to then work through it. And then coupled with some of that information giving, right? For example, since I work in ethnic studies, and we don't just, even though I teach Asian American studies courses, we don't just focus on the Asians, so to speak, right? Really, it's based upon a comparative racial component, critical comparative racial component, to see how all of the different groups, and not just marginalized people of color, but also Anglo groups are mixed in within this. And then we can start to unpack what are those biases and how can we address it in a short-term, but also long-term fashion.
I also think that, when I do training on people, for groups on how to be more innovative and inclusive in their innovation, right, which produces innovation, actually, when you have a diversity of ideas and diversity of perspectives, a lot of it is also, making meta analysis about dynamics within a group a norm, right? So if the first time you ask somebody, could you please unpack that and tell me what is going on there? If that's the first time you've ever said it is during a microaggression, then it's going to be hard for that entire group to grapple with. It's going to be like, oh, what's going on now, right? But if you regularly open your meetings with an icebreaker that cognitively primes people to attend to relationships and ideas, and if you say things like, so I know we're meeting again and we've been working on this project for a long time. I want to remind everyone that not everyone always feels comfortable contributing, and so I'm going to be managing that. But also I want people to to really stay focused, and to really be able to listen to each other and be able to ask questions when you're confused or you feel like something needs to be explained, or if you have a different perspective, right? And it could be even something that's very material, like an engineering project or something. It doesn't always have to be these human relations type things, but it's the meta being able for people to feel comfortable doing that kind of unpacking is what's going to get you not only innovation in terms of ideas and productive conflict that helps you hone ideas, but it will also afford you the ability to talk about things at a meta level when they occur. So it's not just the incident, but sort of the team, right? So you really talk about the team, and you talk about, let's unpack this, let's talk about that. But again, you've got to set that norm so that people are cognitively primed to do that when they are in that setting for that teamwork.
And I just want to give an example of that is that last year, Dr. Wong Lau and a team of us went to NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. And one of the things I appreciated, because we had some sessions in which we were primed about what to do when we go to the conference, right? And Dr. Wong told us, like if you're in the session and you're feeling certain things, right? And perhaps you evokes tears and the such, like don't take up that space, right? And I mean, that don't take up that space, but essentially is come out of that session and call me and we can talk through it, right? But let the presenters finish what they need to finish, instead of, going, oh, it's okay, like taking up that kind of mental capacity and emotional capacity of the room around you. And I think especially for folks in our more kind of majority populations, right, in which we can think of, and we were primed of that before we even went to the conference, because at that conference you deal with a lot of kind of this unpacking the meta communications, and so I think everyone was kind of ready for that discomfort and eager perhaps to talk about it as well.
So on the point of our society having a higher degree of racial spatial segregation than ever, what suggestions do you have to educate young students on the broader, more severe aggressions being experienced by the greater Asian American community? For context, I work with a summer camp in the Bay Area that caters to Asian American students, some of whom have parents who might not have the tools or knowledge to help process.
I think one thing that has been really great, especially in the state of California, is that we have also an ethnic studies now requirement for high schools. So for high school age students, we can, encourage them, look forward to those courses as well in the future, but in the present moment is to have us really understand like the larger macroaggressions don't happen in a vacuum. Right? It's not just like they just mysteriously appeared. I mean, I teach 2 semesters on essentially macroaggressions that happen with API folks in juxtaposition with other groups, right? So if we look at the core of this country, we're just using the US context, let's look at laws. The Naturalization Act of 1790, which was the first legislation passed by the first Congress of the United States, established that if an immigrant were to come to what we then called newly called the United States after we got sovereignty from Great Britain, is that you have to be a free white man in order to naturalize as a citizen of the United States. So let's look back hundreds of years to see how, as a country, we have established that what is the norm here? What is accepted as being the ideal American, right? And then from there, we can start looking at how legally this has manifested in these various racialized politics, right? And in this current moment, it's just a heightened kind of current moment in which we see the globalized world it's not just happening in the United States, right? So we look to Australia and the such, and the UK and Canada, there's also a lot of anti-Asian violence. But if you look back to their legislations as well, you can see that there are legislations that are very much anti-immigrant, right? So even though in the context of the United States, we like to call ourselves, we're a nation of immigrants, we again have to unpack that. What kind of immigrants were encouraged to come to the United States? What kind of immigrants now, right? With the new immigration restrictions, right? And we see, what is it? Is it EB-5 visas are still okay? The ones that if you have, is it $500,000 of investments?
I think 500,000. Yeah, I think $500,000
is like the bare minimum, right?
And I think you have to be willing to locate in an underserved area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So seeing the historical context, also couching that within the contemporary as much as possible, because I work with a lot of high school students as well, and their parents oftentimes are immigrants. And may not know the racial politics of the United States too, right? So if you are a person working with young people, I think it's really important for you to learn about these larger comparative histories and how they still have effects within the contemporary context.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on what Dr. Kwan explained, I think, so well. I think that for many high school students, particularly those who are second gen or 1.5 gen, right? So they're experiencing their identity as being very specific to their own ethnicity, right? So they're Chinese American. It's about, and identity is very cultural artifact based, as well as based on sort of even internal stereotypes of model minority myth, right? So there's a lot of sort of uninterrogated ways in which many people who are in high school who are in this category experience themselves. And I think that when they go off to camp or they go off to college, it's the first time they're actually thinking about their Pan-Asian identity in a meaningful way, right? And so they go off to college and they don't have their group in high school, right? It's just a whole different context. And for I think many of our students, when they hit their first Asian American Studies class, it's like the first time they're thinking of themselves as, wow, I have a connection to other Asian people who came before me in the United States who aren't even related to my family, right? As well as that actually impacts, right? The history of Asian Americans impacts me and who I am as well. And I think that if you can convey that to students in a thoughtful way, that will go a long way to understanding also in parallel and then intersections of how our historical oppressions have intersected, but also how we can be in solidarity with each other. But I think that for me, at least in working with youth, is really a big sort of a big learning point, right? It's kind of like you need to get over that hurdle of understanding your own ethnic identity as well as your Pan-Asian identity, political identity, all those sort of things. So I would say an ethnic studies sort of intro 101 framework is helpful.
And then what's the difference between a macroaggression and hate crimes?
So, wow, okay, so it depends on the state you live in. So hate crimes, so when something is a hate crime, when we use that word crime, it means that it meets its violation of a criminal law, right? And so those are locally based as well as, state, and there are some federal civil rights violations that would be considered hate crimes. Not all macroaggressions are hate crimes. So in a hate crime situation, you have to really, there has to be a nexus of a real clear threat and a real clear threat of harm based on that specific identity. And which is why it's very hard sometimes to prosecute crimes, violent crimes as hate crimes. There has to be a real clear, like, you know, someone can yell something in general about people of color, about any group, and then commit a crime later. It still may not be prosecuted as a hate crime, even though it's macroaggression. So macroaggression is the social, I guess the social science sort of categorization of a violent threat, or physically violent, or of a verbally violent, assaultive threat to somebody, but it may not meet the level of a hate crime. So,
and also the work of,
yeah.
So also the work of Gerald Sue and also Danny Solorzano have also said that for macro versus microaggressions, just for context real quick, is that, so for macroaggressions, it's really on a systemic level, right? And so what does that mean? So legislation, judicial practices, all that kind of stuff. And then the micro is not because it's small, really, but it's more on an individual kind of level. And usually, so there could be certain microaggressions, I think, that can be elevated to the level of what Dr. Wong said, of kind of fitting that kind of crime definition, but also some macroaggressions, for example, like the recent cases in which Black men have been gunned down, and judges or governors saying that it was justified as self-defense or something like that. That is a macro level aggression, right? Because it's coming from the point of the state. But that's not, I mean, people can argue, is that a hate crime? Is it not a hate crime? So just as Dr. Wong says, it depends on the state sometimes too, right?
Then what are some specific strategies that we can do to support our students and faculty during this time?
Well, I think statements from authority, recognizing the situation we're in terms of the increase of xenophobia against all immigrants, but also particularly against Asian Americans because of COVID-19, I think are important. So expressions from authority are important, but those expressions, again, need to have a level of specificity so that people trust that administration or that leadership actually understands what's going on. It's important to address it not only just in the organization, but to let everyone in the organization know that these things are happening outside of the organization as well, and that impacts the climate of the organization. So there are some things that are beyond your control, but they still are impacting people because people have to interact with the outside world. They're not just in your Zoom call or in your organization. The other thing I think is to do trainings like this, and also to look at where are the gaps in understanding, even within groups, but also across groups, and then try to provide some sort of structure to address those issues. It's a difficult it's a difficult undertaking. Again, if you haven't been doing that for other groups, then it can seem as if you're only acting on this because these are the people that are represented in the organization. So there's an ethics, I think, of trying to do this in a way that you are trying to address different communities, but also to make sure that you're doing that in coordination so that you're not contradicting yourselves, right, between how you're treating groups. So.
Then, do you have any success stories of anti-Asian bias being addressed by systems prior to the pandemic that we can learn about, tools that have helped in the past?
I can certainly think of the various, I would say, internship-based leadership programs, APITA-type leadership programs for youth and for college students, right, that have been, I think, quite successful in educating students on activism, on how to intervene, on literacy about issues, so that when they go back to their campus or they go on to college, if they're like high school, they're able to sorry, that was probably really loud, sorry. They're able to insert themselves, right, in terms of leadership. I think that's very successful because they often will, they're on the ground and they understand how some of their peers, maybe who haven't had some of that training, are thinking about their identity in maybe overly problematic, simplistic ways. And so I think some of those leadership programs are quite successful and should be supported. Right?
Yeah,
Sorry, sorry, real quickly, you mentioned a specific program, and I think you used an acronym for, is it APIDA?
Oh, I'm sorry, APIDA, so Asian Pacific Islander Desi American. So that's, you know, it's a term that's trying to be inclusive of South Asians as well as Pacific Islanders.
Oh,
right?
Thank you.
Because I think when we think of Asian American, we tend to always think of people we call East Asian, right? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, so I think the interaction, I guess, between the on-the-grounds internships along with, and, you know, as a ethnic studies faculty person, I'm always going to be plugging the ethnic studies, right? But really is that I've seen colleagues of mine who were ethnic studies majors and also students of mine who were ethnic studies majors or minors or whatnot, go into these various fields, whether it is in tech, in politics, in the medical sphere, right? Take with them what they have learned to have a more comprehensive, critical understanding of the various things that they're working through and dealing with, right? So, for example, there was a book, Sophia Umoja Noble has a book called Algorithms of Oppression, right? That even the tech field, we see the tech field is, you know, algorithms, they can't be biased, can they? They're just numbers and all that kind of stuff. Well, when we really dig down, we can see how certain algorithms manifest in ways that show certain biases, right? So for example, the example that she gave was that if you Google Black boys, right? What images pop up on Google? It's not by random by any means, right? There are algorithms that are written by people. So I think if we are able to provide a comprehensive critical race and ethnic studies education to folks of different fields, various different fields, that has been very successful in, I think, unpacking some of the underlying biases that we have.
Thank you. We'll have time for just one more question, but I'll quickly put up our email addresses if there's any additional questions or want to contact us. So the last question is, what are your thoughts on the efficacy of restorative justice techniques and strategies on the institutional level with regard to addressing transgressions?
So I actually have some feelings about this, I guess. So I think that restorative justice can be done well, but I think it takes a lot more work than people think. Like if you're going to set up a restorative justice program or a series of like workshops or gatherings or, you know, whatever it is that you're going to do in terms of programming, I think there's always one of the I guess the treacherous things that can happen is if you do not properly anchor it at every given moment in systemic injustice, it will turn out being sort of a kindness campaign thing. And if you only surround a specific incident, so this happens, right? So it happens at organizations, it happens on campuses where you've got this lightning bolt, you know, viral incident that occurs and everyone feels like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. Whereas people who are in that group are like, this happens all the time. This is the one that went viral, right? So if you focus it only on that one specific incident and you don't focus on systemic inequities within that institution, then you run the risk, I think, of having sort of you get stuck in these activity traps where people come away feeling good, not having learned about how they're contributing to systemic injustice all along. So I can be a nice person and do these nice deeds, right? These nice acts and not actually contribute to my understanding or the organization's understanding about systemic injustice. So I'll just say that. I think it needs to be very carefully scaffolded, and the speakers and trainers and everybody really have to be trained, and facilitators need to be trained to try to always draw it back to systemic issues during all of the programming. So, yeah.
So with that, I want to thank Drs. Kwan and Wong Lau for their expertise and their time in sharing with us today. And I want to thank you all for that joined us today, and for Councilman Morales for his comments and leadership as well. Again, if you have any questions, our email's on there, and we will be sending the slides and recording probably later today along with the survey, if you could just be so kind to fill it out. Thank you again for your time, and have a great day.